So for quality work, we need to use quality materials, and that includes our watercolors. If you use a typical set of watercolors, you're going to end up with some colors that you don't need and that don't mix well together. So we're going to learn about the pigments in our paints that we want to choose for the most successful results. So what are pigments? This is an example of a pigment, a French ultramarine. And a pigment is basically an inorganic or organic material that is finely ground into a powder and then mixed with a binder such as gum arabic or honey. There are three things that I want you to consider about paints and pigments: light fastness, pigment numbers, and the level of transparency. So what is light fastness? Light fastness is the permanency of a pigment or color once it's painted on your paper. You either have a highly light fast or permanent pigment, or you have a fugitive pigment, which means the pigment will eventually disappear. So to demonstrate the effect that using a fugitive pigment might have on your paintings, here is a bright red cardinal that I painted. It's vibrant glowing red, right? Well, let's say I used alizarin crimson, a known fugitive pigment, to paint some of the darker parts of the bird. Over time, this red pigment might fade or turn gray and completely change the original look of this cardinal. So I only use paints with a light fast rating of 1 or 2. If I spend all this time making a painting, I want to make sure that the paints and the paintings that I make stand the test of time. So every paint tube features a letter and a combo number, which represent the pigments used in the paint. I'm holding a tube of French ultramarine blue here, and it says on the side PB29. So PB means pigment blue, and 29 is the number of that pigment. That means it's a single pigment paint. Single pigment paints are just what you'd expect. They are made from one pigment alone, whereas compound pigment paints are comprised of 2 or more pigments. So on this tube, one pigment number means one pigment. On this tube, however, there are multiple pigment numbers, and that means it's a compound pigmented paint. So for a limited palette, we want to choose single pigment paints. A compound paint is often called a convenience color because the pigments are already mixed in the tube, so you don't have to mix them on your palette. And there's nothing wrong with that. They're great for convenience. But when we're learning the foundations of color mixing and we want to make these clear, luminous colors, we want as pure and simple a paint as possible, so we'll focus on using single pigment paints only. Once you've learned the foundations of color mixing with these single pigments, you'll be able to use what you've learned to add some compound paints to your palette.